Hello, everybody. I am Jayme CheeseSlice, the engineer and producer of Uncontrolled Opposition, and I'm going to turn off that music. Hi, we've got a good show for you today. We've got Dr. Meryl Nass. She's going to join us to talk about the bioweapons program that we never had because it's illegal. We would never do such a thing. But, well, surprise, surprise, we do have that, and former DNI Tulsi Gabbard revealed that to everybody. So she's going to come on and talk about that and a little bit more. So if this is the first time you've ever watched Uncontrolled Opposition on the YouTube instead of listening to us on the radio, we are first and foremost a radio program. We record those radio shows here live. I cut them up for the radio, but if you're watching us here, you get to see everything uncut and stuff that doesn't actually make it onto the radio. So that's like the bonus content we do right here on YouTube and Rumble and the other platforms that you might be watching this on. So without further ado, let's go ahead and bring on Gloria and Jeremy, the hosts of Uncontrolled Opposition. Hello, guys. How are you doing?
Oh, hey,
where did Jeremy go? There he is. All right. I'm going to put Gloria there, put me on the bottom. All right. So I hope you guys are ready. We're going to bring on Dr. Meryl Nass. Hello. Welcome to the show.
Hey.
I'm going to hand it over to Gloria right now. She's going to kick off the show and start rolling with it. So let's do it.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to Uncontrolled Opposition, where together we battle mind wars with truth strikes. I'm Gloria Guillo, an investigative journalist, and I'm here with my co-host, Professor Jeremy Kuzmarov, managing editor of Covert Action magazine. Our producer and engineer is Jayme CheeseSlice. The opinions you hear are ours and that of our guest, not those of WBAI or the Pacifica Foundation. This content is intended for informational and educational purposes only and should not be interpreted as professional, medical, or legal advice. Listeners are encouraged to form their own opinions and consult with their own physicians. Today, we are happy to welcome back to our show Dr. Meryl Nass, physician, researcher, and public health advocate, to discuss former DNI Tulsi Gabbard's document drop on the U.S. bioweapons program involving 120 biolabs in 30 countries and her investigative work on Anthrax, detailing the difference between biodefense and biowarfare. While we are critical of this newly released information, we also note that when Tulsi was a congresswoman and an Army officer, she courageously stated back in March 2022, shortly after Ukraine was invaded, that the U.S. was funding dozens of bioweapon labs there. Tulsi called for a ceasefire around those sites to secure them and prevent any accidental or intentional release that could spark another pandemic. She emphasized the difference between research labs and bioweapon labs and accused the Biden administration of trying to cover up their existence. The backlash was swift and brutal. Republican Senator Mitt Romney and others accused her of parroting Russian propaganda and spreading treasonous lies. Media outlets and politicians painted her comments as amplifying Kremlin disinformation. Tulsi pushed back, insisting the lab's existence was a matter of public record, and her concern was purely about biosecurity risks during active fighting. Anthrax. I remember anthrax up close and personal. I worked in New York City government close to the World Trade Center before, during, and after 9/11. From my terrace in Brooklyn Heights, I saw the first tower fall. Everyone on rooftops watching screamed with me when the first tower fell into its own footprint in seconds, because it was surprising and made no sense structurally from the visible damage. Many of us already knew from the selection of G.W. Bush Jr. as president that the predator class was up to something big. Clearly, 9/11 was controlled demolition and a treasonous inside job. It wasn't their first false flag. Under the guise of protecting us, this massive false flag heralded in the anytime, anywhere nebulous war on terror and war against our constitutional rights. The authorization for use of military force was signed into law on September 18th, and the loss of our constitutional rights came soon after with the Patriot Act on October 26th. Keep in mind the act was drafted under the Clinton administration even before the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. We talk about that false flag in an earlier episode. Back to my 9/11 account. Mayor Giuliani required city employees in buildings located near Wall Street to return to work a few days after Tuesday, September 11th, so the financial center could be reopened on Monday, September 17th. We were wrongly told that the dust and smoke were not toxic to breathe. A few years ago, I received victims' compensation funds for the asthma I developed. Many workers developed cancer. So far, I consider myself lucky. Riding the remaining working subway from Brooklyn Heights to the financial center was frightening. After 9/11, every time the train stopped short, we would look up from our reading material at the faces of the people sitting opposite us to search for answers until the train jerked and rumbled forward again. Then we would nod to each other and make a collective sigh of relief with our exhalation. Exiting the subway station, we walked past smoking wreckage on the way back to our offices. Oddly, there was nothing we could identify there. No desks, chairs, file cabinets, or plane parts. It was just gray ash and some large pieces of twisted metal. I showed my city ID on every street corner to the military and police stationed all over the area in Humvees to pass. Just when New Yorkers thought nothing worse could happen, something else did. In mid-October, letters containing anthrax spores were received by news organizations and Senate offices. Senators Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy, who saw changes to the Patriot Act during negotiations, ultimately voted in favor of its final passage after receiving letters laced with anthrax. Coincidence or coercive threat? We will never know. Around this time, air monitoring devices popped up on subway platforms at major transfer stations like 34th Street and 42nd Street. Out of concern, many of us went to military supply stores to purchase gas masks. The rubber masks completely covered our faces and strapped around our head. They fit into our backpacks and large purses. The grief over loved ones still missing or killed and fear of new attacks was palpable citywide as we dug ourselves out of our own personal debris. I received FEMA funds to clean up the gray flake dust that covered the interior of my co-op, despite keeping my windows closed and only using air conditioning. After 9/11, subway bomb scares became commonplace, and white powder spills shut down major subway transfer stations regularly. I recall Penn Station was shut because white powder was found on an elevator control panel buttons. It turned out to be the powdered sugar from a jelly donut. We laughed. Gallows humor is funny in times of stress. Later learning that our government's bioweapons program was never really halted and its testing in metropolitan areas on unwitting members of the public continued was highly disturbing, but not surprising. So when we talk about bioweapons here today, we are not only talking about faraway concepts in distant lands, we are talking about deadly pathogens that can affect us right here and right now. And we are talking about a fear of bioweapons that can immobilize a city or nation or world, and even worse, a fear so pervasive it can get people to turn on their neighbors and own beloved family members. Keep in mind, some evidence points to COVID-19 being a bioweapon developed by Ralph Baric in North Carolina with funding from the NIH. Remember Dr. Fauci? Also, keep in mind that COVID-19 resulted in one of the biggest transfers of wealth from the working class to the predator class in history. We ask, cui bono, which is Latin for who benefits? It's a standard investigative question that focuses on who stands to gain from an event. Dr. Nass is an expert. Let's learn from her so we can protect ourselves from false narratives and limited hangouts regarding bioweapons made in labs or government funds at home and abroad that leak or are intentionally used against us to force compliance. We know that fear is one of the most effective tools in the social engineer's manipulative toolbox. Let's fight fear with knowledge. Dr. Nass, thank you for returning to our show. Please let us know what's in Tulsi's report and why it's a limited hangout. And then, how do we distinguish between biodefense and bioweapon labs?
Well, that were those were two open-ended questions. So how do you distinguish between biodefense and biooffense? I think it's very difficult. I wrote a paper describing what the military, what the Defense Department had published in an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association going back to the late 1980s, in which it claimed that you could distinguish between them, and certain things were only offensive and those were not permitted, and other things that were purely defensive were permitted. And I showed that among the things that the DoD were not permitted was actually research they were doing. So that was what that paper was about. I think that, the Biological Weapons Convention, which the United States initiated in 1972 under President Nixon, which he promised to initiate in 1970, was deliberately written in order to give us, a backdoor, a way out, so that intent was made a major criterion for determining whether certain research was offensive or defensive. And of course, intent is something that can't be measured. And you don't need to produce a lot. It's not like a chemical weapon or a bomb where you have to produce a lot of stuff in order to get the effect, because bacteria, for instance, E. coli, can double in 20 minutes. So within 24 hours, from a very, very tiny amount, you can get a very large amount with, 3 doublings in an hour, or 72 doublings. You get trillions or quadrillions more of the bacteria than you started with at the end of a day, if everything goes well. So you can't use amounts as a criterion. And Kissinger, who was working with the president on this, was very aware that he or the people he worked with knew that intent gave them an open door. So let me leave that there for the moment, and I can talk about gain of function later if you like. The other question was, what did Tulsi release and why was it a limited hangout? Tulsi released in the week or a week and a half before she left office, and she left office on the 18th or 19th of June. She released first 4 pages of very small type information that was supposed to be declassified information on biolabs in Ukraine. And some of this information was already in the public domain. You had to blow it up in order to be able to read it. And it was really very limited information. I would say it was some of it talked about money, how much the United States had paid for 4 labs, and it averaged under $2.5 million per lab, and which isn't very much. And you can't really have a very good high containment laboratory for $2.5 million. And one of the pages that was released suggested that there was only one of 13 labs that were mentioned that actually had a high containment lab, and all the others were low containment labs. And what's a low containment lab? It's equivalent to what you have in a hospital laboratory anywhere in the United States. It means basically the lab techs wear gloves, they wear a white coat, and when they are growing bacterial cultures or putting potential viral cultures into media, they are working under a hood that sucks air away from the room and puts it through a filter so that whatever they're doing is not spread into the room, the rest of the lab, and into the community. So that's, this is a basic, very routine, very minor lab setup, biosafety level 2. And the United States government indicated that of the 13 labs they mentioned, only one was beyond that, and that was in Odessa. So we also had one of the documents listed a number of pathogens that were being studied in one lab. And many of these pathogens were very dangerous and would not be allowed to be studied under biosafety level 2. They would require a 3 or a 4.
Can you recite them? Are they handy?
Well, anthrax was one, African swine fever was another, Newcastle disease was another. So anthrax in the United States is required to be studied at biosafety level 3 minimum by law. And what was interesting to me was that African swine fever and Newcastle disease were both misspelled, or not, the names were not quite right, in order presumably to avoid searches, electronic searches. So I thought that was the most interesting thing I found on that page was, and by the way, both African swine fever and Newcastle disease had allegedly been used as weapons by the U.S. against Cuba in the 70s and maybe the 80s, but mainly it was the 1970s when we were allegedly attacking them with a series of biological weapons. So I think it was a limited hangout in terms of the amount that was spent. They made it sound like it wasn't much, but since Black & Veatch is a major Defense Department contractor that was managing most or all of these labs these biolabs in Ukraine that the U.S. paid for, we saw that they were being paid about $1 billion to manage Ukraine labs. So it was much more than $2.5 million per lab. There was, even though a map that was provided showed the location of 13 biolabs, somewhere else it said there were at least 40. So there were at least 27 that we know nothing about. And some of the information seemed to be intended to indicate that what was in the labs that the Russians had found was actually from the old Soviet era, rather than, in other words, before the United States was paying for the labs, they had all this stuff. It wasn't our money that was buying these dangerous pathogens. It was the old Soviet money. But, can you really believe that? Because the Soviet system went down 35 years ago. And so really, they're still studying the same pathogens and they're studying them for the Soviets? No, they're being paid by the US, and presumably they're studying them for us, as well as perhaps for themselves. So there were a couple of other things. The documents, so these were supposed to be declassified documents. Well, some of the information had no business being classified. It was like, these are our partners in this research, and they were academic institutions and other federal agencies and wouldn't be classified. And you could find that information out by just looking at US government spending websites. So even though the idea was that this is declassified information, much of it was not. The other thing is, if these were really declassified documents, well, government documents have dates, and they have a to and a from, who created the document and where's it going and what's the purpose. And none of these documents had that. So that had all been removed. Or these documents were created specially for this release and weren't actually declassified documents, but maybe had been derived from declassified documents. But they didn't appear to be original documents because they didn't have this necessary information. So for all those reasons, I thought it was a bit of a limited hangout. It was good that she acknowledged that the US did in fact have at least 40 biolabs in Ukraine. But from the release, you really couldn't tell what they were doing, why we had them, what was the plan. you did know that we had a program there to train scientists in how to deal with very dangerous organisms. So that was released. So we knew that that scientists were being trained in how to work in high containment laboratories using deadly microorganisms. But
one of the things you and I discussed that you brought to my attention is the beauty of labs that are outside the United States, as far as different FOIL requests and things like that, that they're outside of certain scrutiny. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So, right. So Congress doesn't get to know what's going on. You can't FOIA a lab in Ukraine, especially since, I think some of these labs were, or all perhaps, were under the auspices of the Ukrainian government. So we had certain access to them, but we didn't own them completely, which would make it very difficult, as I say, for a FOIA request, or even if if a team of Congress members wanted to go and find out what was going on, they might or might not be given permission to do that. And as we get into the anthrax letters, you can see why it would make sense to get the anthrax from a lab in another country, because you could probably make sure that members of Congress and the US public would never be able to get the information of, where it was made, who made it, why they made it, who they handed it over to, et cetera. It'd be much more secure than having the anthrax made within the United States.
Well, Dr. Nass and I had a discussion before the show, and I had believed naively the FBI report on the origins of the letters, that they came out of Fort Detrick. And Dr. Nass corrected me on that, and she shared with me a lot of the work that she had done, which I read, and I am completely convinced that it didn't, and that the person who was blamed for it was set up and had nothing to do with this. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So it's a very long story. So the anthrax letters were sent, right? And we had a Keystone Cops, the Three Stooges attempt by the FBI to find out who sent them. And there was even an FBI agent who was very high up in the case who later became a whistleblower. And he got into all kinds of trouble, and they tried to ruin his life, ruined his marriage. He couldn't get work anywhere. So the FBI needed, or were told they needed a patsy. They needed a person who had sent them. And so they went through a list of 6 or 8 different people. One drank himself to death. One, Bruce Ivins, finally committed suicide. He was one of the last in a long line. There were 2 Pakistani brothers who were scientists in, I can't remember if it was Maryland or Pennsylvania. I think it was southern Pennsylvania. They went back to Pakistan. There was an ER doctor in New Jersey. The fellow who drank himself to death had been a scientist at Fort Detrick who'd worked on anthrax. And I was told by other scientists at Fort Detrick who befriended me when I began to defend Bruce Ivins, who was someone I had known. I'd met him in 1991 or 1992. So I'd known him for 10 years before the anthrax letters at a conference on biodefense. We happened to sit next to each other, and we became friends. So anyway, the FBI had tried to pin this on a lot of other people, and then I was told by people at Fort Detrick they were trying to break the anthrax scientists at Fort Detrick and put tremendous pressure on them, put them under all kinds of surveillance. And Bruce Ivins was the one who broke first and, started drinking heavily, was threatened, was told he was going to be charged with a capital crime and they would ask for the death penalty. And eventually he committed suicide. And as soon as he committed suicide, within 3 days, the FBI announced that they had solved the case. This is 7 years later. but they needed somebody to die that they could pin it on, so they could avoid actually having to present a case in court because they didn't have a case. And so that happened. And then I had been writing about the case on and off for a long time. And unfortunately, because I didn't want to get Bruce Ivins into any more trouble than he was already in, I had stopped contacting him years before, because I was a known quantity. I was an activist, I was a threat to the system because I knew too much about anthrax and the anthrax vaccine, and I'd been involved with the legal case that took away the license of the anthrax vaccine back in 2004. So anyway, I felt bad that I had not been in contact with him before he committed suicide and had not tried to help him then, and I felt some obligation to try to help clear his name if that's where the facts went. And they did. And so I wrote about all the problems with the FBI story, which was a lot of scientific problems, a lot of PR problems, and a series of lies. They issued lie after lie after lie over the years. And then as one lie would be, discovered and identified, they would just lie about something else. And anyway, at the end of the day, they had no case whatsoever. I was even mentioned in the FBI report as somebody who was hassling Ivins, which is, the opposite of what was actually happening. It was the FBI that was making his life miserable. And, and as I said, I had nothing to do with him at that point because I wanted to spare him and everyone. I didn't want to. The FBI couldn't pin the anthrax letters on me because I'd never done any lab work with anthrax. I had no access to it, but these guys at Fort Detrick and others, all of them were looked at as potential FBI victims.
We also talked about how, when you talk about motives and things like that, we talked about some of the things that really happened with this anthrax, and they like to pick on a lone gunman or a lone crazy person, as opposed to looking at really what's behind it. And we had discussed the change in the budget, and it jumped after the anthrax letters from, let's see if I could find my note, from, I think it was something like, where did I put it? Okay, from oops, now I can't open it up. Like 53 million was the budget to something like, I think, 1.5 billion because of the anthrax. And then you pointed out to me that the budget now after COVID is now 10 billion, right?
Yeah, even before COVID was 10 billion. And in fact, Biden, in his, I think it was his 2024 proposed budget. So he provides a budget, and then Congress can do what it wants with that budget. But he had 20 billion for biodefense, 6 billion alone for CDC, and then more, for DARPA and BARDA and all these other, Fauci at NIH, et cetera. So yes, 9/11 was an opportunity to massively expand the biodefense industry. And that was very important because people who owned companies that decided to make biodefense products immediately thereafter, or bought companies, were sometimes friends of, leaders of the Democratic Party when Clinton was president, and the Republican Party when Bush was president. And so this was basically a new money stream, and a very important money stream because it was the Wild West. So when you suddenly start saying we need to get, smallpox vaccine or anthrax vaccine, or we need drugs to combat African swine fever, or whatever it is, you don't know what the research is going to cost. You don't know what the products will be like that will be developed. You don't know how many doses you need. You don't know how safe and effective they are. And so all a company needs to do is say they have a product. For smallpox, for instance, there's no smallpox left in the world. So you cannot test a vaccine or a drug against smallpox, right? You have to test it against something else, and you don't really know if it's going to work. But also, so you can also charge what you want. You can say it costs as much as you want to make it. So, for example, when we had COVID, we had remdesivir, and they were charging several $1,000s for a 5-day course. When it only cost, I think, under $100 to make. So once you got into biodefense, you had to convince the government, if you had a company or if you were creating a company, what we need is smallpox vaccine, or what we need is a drug for anthrax, what we need is a test for African swine fever. And if you could get a contract, that contract could be for any amount, because nobody really knew what the amount should be. And so you were looking at potentially very, very high profitability for the anthrax vaccine,
blank checks. They're like blank. It's like a blank check.
It's a blank check. As long as you have your friends in Congress and in the administration that will vote for it, that will allot the money for you. So there was a report during did it come out during the Bush administration? I can't remember, but a Democrat NGO, I think it was Center for American Progress, actually paid for a report on anthrax vaccine and showed they were making 300% profit.
Wow. And another thing you pointed out was that, there was trouble trying to connect Iraq to the World Trade Center collapse, and beget the United States. Washington wanted to bomb Iraq. So this anthrax gave kind of a excuse to do it, because everyone, I think your quote was, everyone knew they had an anthrax stockpile.
Yeah. That's really important. So we know from the person who was the initial Secretary of the Treasury under the Bush II administration that as soon as he got into the administration, he immediately heard talk about, we got to go fight Iraq. And he was surprised by that. So that was the plan way before 6 or 8 months before 9/11. And so we knew, the media had told us that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, biological weapons. There was a woman scientist in charge. They made the story very sexy. What they did not tell you is that Rumsfeld had been to Iraq, and made deals to actually supply Iraq years earlier with chemical and biological agents and weapons. And, the chemical weapons that were found during the Gulf War and that were sometimes exploded by us or used on our troops actually had U.S. markings on them. Well, the anthrax was transferred. There were a number of agents that were transferred, but I know about the anthrax was called Volume 1B. That was the strain. And it was the strain that the United States had used when it made anthrax weapons in World War II. So this was a particularly virulent strain. It wasn't our worst strain. We had strains that were more harmful subsequently, but we knew that this was a bad strain. And this was the strain that the Commerce Department allowed the American Type Culture Collection in Manassas, Virginia, to transfer to the Atomic Energy Agency in Iraq. Now, why would we do that? I think we did it because we were hoping they would use it on Iran at the time. We had, during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, we had helped both sides at different times.
Through Israel too. So, it was crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got a couple questions. One related to the Gabbard documents. Well, yeah, it seems to be reminiscent of this JFK release. If you followed those documents, actually a lot of it was just kind of junk. It was stuff that had nothing to do with the JFK assassination, and they're kind of billing it. That I think Trump tried to create this persona of himself that he was battling the deep state. And, with Russiagate, he was a victim of Russiagate. So I think these document release are just trying to cultivate this political maybe image. But when you analyze those documents, it's I mean, there was some value because I reviewed at least some of the JFK documents, and there was some interesting documents related to like CIA operations in the Cold War. Although you can find that stuff, yeah, if you go to the National Archive, there's other documents just like that. And there was nothing really new about the JFK assassination. So that seems to be what you're saying. I haven't analyzed yet those, gone through the Gabbard documents, but it seems to be a parallel, and it's maybe a political strategy to try and, sustain this persona of Trump, even though Gabbard leaving. And then my question is, what about the COVID origin? Like, are there any new insights about that? And what is your, having studied, being an expert on COVID, what is your sense of the origin of COVID and the link to, gain of function research and perhaps being manufactured in the biolabs of Ukraine, although we don't know, as you say.
So there were two releases of Tulsi Gabbard. The first one was only 4 pages, and there was no fluff in that. I don't think it was very useful, but there was no fluff. But then the second release was almost 400 pages, and that was more like the JFK assassination file, where there were multiple copies and a lot of irrelevancies. So that was padded, I would say. If it took months for these people to go through these documents to find out what should be released, they could have cleaned it up, and made it relevant. But within these almost 400 pages, it was all about getting Fauci in trouble. It did talk about his weekly visits with the intelligence community and how he somehow managed to convince them to use only the experts he gave them to study COVID origins and things like that. So I would say that the second release was a cherry-picked document. It was designed to be boring and waste your time. You know how these things go. It's exactly like the JFK. I didn't read the JFK documents, but I've looked at other, a lot of times when the intelligence agencies release documents, you get 3 or 4 copies of the same thing, and sometimes 10. The Pfizer releases were the same, where I saw sometimes more than 10 copies of the same document. It's just designed to waste your time so you give up. But what was interesting to me about the second release is that it exactly paralleled what had been said by Jim Ertman on April 30th. He was the CIA whistleblower. He's lost his job now. And he spoke to Congress about, and he spoke only about declassified information. He spoke in public about COVID origins and about the role of Fauci. He was also the leader of a group called the DIG, the Directors Intelligence Group, or something like that, that was investigating 3 issues, one of them being COVID origins. And so it is likely that he had something to do with choosing the documents that were released, all of which, were corroborating what he had told Congress. And I think that, we don't have to argue about those documents. I think everybody knows that Fauci was able to control the narrative. What we don't know is where Fauci was getting his orders from. So I'll leave that there. Now, in terms of COVID origins, so in my view, now let me just say, I'm a doctor. I know a lot about the symptoms and signs of COVID. I am not a molecular biologist. I'm not a virologist, so I don't have a PhD. I have an MD. Yes, I have a bachelor's degree in biology from MIT. So and I've worked in a lab. I know something, but I don't know enough. I didn't work in a lab for 50 years. But from looking at the genetic structure of COVID, there are many things in the genome of the virus and the vaccine. And again, I'm not expert on this, but I've interviewed people, I've talked to a lot of people, and I've paid attention to documents. There are things that are not seen in naturally occurring coronaviruses, and this COVID was a beta coronavirus. There were multiple things, in my view, added to make it easier to get the viral genome into cells, so it could start producing the protein and or producing more viral particles. I think there's no question about that there were 2 or 3 ways at least that would enhance the cell entry. And there were a number of things that enhanced virulence. So I can't say for sure why those little, what are termed HIV inserts, were inserted there, but most likely it was to impair the immune response. There are many ways that have been identified that COVID, and particularly the vaccine is much worse than the virus. They're both very bad. The vaccine can damp down the immune response, not only to the COVID virus, SARS-CoV-2, but also to cancer and to other infections. So the more doses of the vaccine you received, if they were good doses, if the material in them was still active, and I do want to say that many people who got the vaccine were not harmed, but many were.
I recall, back in the day, I think Rogowski, remind me his name.
James Rogowski, in my opinion, is an agent for the government.
Okay. Well, there was some report about there being something called "How Bad Is My Batch?"
Yes. Now those people, the people who did that work, I think are good, as far as I can tell.
So what they determined is that people would look up their COVID batch number, which is on their card, right, when they get the vaccine, and then they would see whether or not their particular batch was one that's associated with
more VAERS reports,
symptoms and VAERS reports and things like that, and that there seemed to be some either inconsistency in the production of these vaccines, or this might have been something else, because it seemed that certain batches were distributed throughout the United States, throughout the world, in different concentrations, so that, let's say, one batch wouldn't go exclusively to New York City. Some of that batch would go to New York City, and the rest of it might go to Los Angeles. Is that accurate?
So what we found with vaccines in general is that in order to dilute any identification of side effects from any vaccine, lots have often been spread widely rather than concentrated in one area, so that no one health department or doctor or practice or hospital is going to identify all the side effects, which may be similar. So we've seen that before. In fact, there's a name for bad vaccine lots. They're called hot lots. Now, in terms of the COVID vaccines, how bad is my batch? The fellow was named Parta Cooper, who first worked on that and worked with Sasha Latipova, and I believe they're both trustworthy. But you have to, the data look good. It has to be reproduced by others, and I haven't seen, that may have been, but I haven't seen any reproductions. So I don't want to say that. I heard Kevin McKernan, who is very reliable, is a molecular biologist, talk about how only 4% of the vaccine was really dangerous. But I don't know that. What I can say is both of my children got vaccinated, and they claim they didn't have any side effects. And they might have been, one was a doctor and one's a computer science professor and works for Google. And so they might have been people who you didn't want to harm. Especially they didn't want to harm doctors because they didn't want doctors to realize how bad the vaccine was. So, I do believe that there were lots that were not harmful, either because the vaccine was no longer active or because they may have contained a placebo instead. I mean, we don't know. We don't know any of that. So some people say 30% were placebo. We just don't know. There are lots of claims by different people. Why has the government, and Pfizer and Moderna and the other companies, why have they kept all this so secret? That's a very good question. Previously, if there's an issue of a hot lot, it's supposed to be investigated immediately. And the dose is quarantined.
I think I also recall reading that executives within the drug companies were given special batches and not the other batch. Is that true?
Yes, that was acknowledged by somebody who worked for Pfizer. So the original batches were made using one method that did not involve E. coli plasmids. I think it used PCR, but I'm not sure. And then the major batches of Pfizer, Pfizer and Moderna both used plasmids that were in E. coli bacteria that had, that were coded to make the vaccine. And then they were supposed to purify them so that you wouldn't have any plasmid left. You would only have the vaccine antigen. And apparently they weren't very well purified, either to save money or to save time or both. And what that meant was that they contained DNA as well as RNA, sometimes considerable amounts, like up to 30% of the nucleic acids were DNA when they were all supposed to be RNA. And this increased the likelihood of the material getting into your nucleus, your cell's nucleus, and causing mutations. So it made it easier to cause mutations in people. Now, most mutations are not a big problem. The only mutations that are a really big problem is if they happen in your germ cells, your eggs. And for women, all your eggs are pretty much made when you're born. But for men, you're making sperm constantly. So it's more of a problem for men. In the Pfizer vaccine, but not the Moderna, allegedly, within that plasmid was the code for two proteins from SV40, SV40 being a monkey virus that has been linked to certain cancers. Mesothelioma is one. And also, those proteins help enable DNA to get into a cell nucleus. So there is a question of whether those were deliberately, it would seem, deliberately placed on the E. coli plasmid to enhance mutations in the recipients of the vaccine. So that's an open question. Allegedly, the SV40 code was not in the Moderna vaccines. How much any of these changes contributes to the overall toxicity has not been elucidated. What we do know is that cancer rates have gone up, especially in young people. CDC has been reluctant to provide good data on cancer rates. So now every state should have a cancer registry, and so you should be able to get good data from the states. But anyway, I haven't seen it, so I don't know if anyone's done that. So I don't know how much cancer has increased, but I think we can assume that cancer has increased. And one would anticipate, but I haven't seen any data, that deaths from infectious diseases, serious infectious diseases, would have increased as well.
Well, on a personal level, I'm seeing a lot of deaths amongst family members, friends, especially after they've received boosters and flu shots and all kinds of things like that.
So the more boosters you get, it seems that the worse off you are. I mean, getting boosters is a crazy thing to do because COVID has become a minor illness. Generally it's a cold now for most people. And so why would you want a booster? Unless you really believe the government. I mean, why would you believe the government now after everything that's happened? I mean, we've gone to war with Iraq supposedly because of their nuclear weapons, which we supposedly destroyed when we bombed them last year. But we're not bombing their nuclear weapons. We haven't asked them to end, or we have, but we haven't seriously asked them to end their nukes. But we seem to be going after the Strait of Hormuz, which we knew they would close. And I mean, and every day it's a different justification. It's a different story. And now we're bombing their water supplies and their food supplies, which are war crimes. And why are we doing this? And the Trump family is involved with creating a new thing, a pipeline and rail and road and fiber optic that's going all the way between India and Europe through Israel, and Iran is sort of has a competing system of some kind with China, and we want to destroy that. And we've bombed the rail lines between Iran and China to stop China getting oil from Iran by rail. I mean, things are going on, and we're given crazy stories to explain it. Why would anyone believe anything that this administration or the last one tells us?
Mm-hmm. And with just a few minutes we have left, since you're an expert on the COVID, I think, people are still, we know we've been lied to, but we don't really know what happened, as far as how this disease originated. And then as you pointed out, it's more like a flu, a minor flu. I mean, some people believe it's not even a real disease. It seems clear that the government greatly exaggerated to create this fear climate, just like with the anthrax, that they greatly exaggerated the ravages of COVID. So, maybe you want to say something at the end about that, or just your general theory. How should we understand the whole COVID affair?
Experience.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just give you my opinion because
it
would take too long to try to back it up.
Yeah.
I believe COVID is real for sure. I certainly had a bad case of it twice. I was extremely ill. Even when I took ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, I was very ill. But I'm old. I was 70 or so at the time. For most people, it was not a severe disease, but I certainly had plenty of patients for whom it was a severe disease and who thought they might die, and usually the drugs helped them and occasionally they didn't. These viruses mutate, these RNA viruses are rapid mutators. And what we knew about coronaviruses in humans prior to COVID was that they cause colds. So I expected this one to keep mutating and basically become a cold if it didn't even go away altogether. And that seems to be what has happened for most people. Again, if your immune system is impaired, there's no, all bets are off. I believe, this is funny. This has been my opinion from the beginning, from early in 2020. I believe that all these little bits and pieces that were added to make COVID came from different labs. Maybe some came from the same lab, but I think they had been developed by coronavirus researchers, particularly Ralph Baric, who is the preeminent coronavirus researcher in the United States. And they some could be developed in other places. He also developed the, what were they called? The humanized mice. And and he developed what he called the no-see-em method of adding bits to coronaviruses that could, and where your genetic engineering couldn't be detected. Yeah. So what he thought couldn't be detected. But so anyway, I think that somebody put them all together and knew what they were doing and did it because they were told to by a military, presumably ours. And presumably, I'd like to also know where the recipe for the vaccine came from. I would very much like to know that, since the military was involved. Whitney Webb pointed that out at the beginning of Warp Speed. It's like, well, there's some people here from the FDA, but most of these people are military that are working in Warp Speed. Now, why would that be? So somebody or people, labs, put it together, developed it. It was developed as a weapon. And then the vaccine was definitely developed as a weapon, an even worse weapon. And I think the military gave the recipe for the vaccine to these companies, but I'm not sure how much they did on their own and how much came from elsewhere. And the disease was absolutely exaggerated by all the media and by the government. And when we saw videos of people dropping dead on the street, just falling down, that's ridiculous. Nobody, when you're that sick, you don't go walking around on the street looking normal and then drop dead. That's a science fiction movie.
Although we did see that after people got the vaccine. We saw
that's a whole other thing. Yes,
we saw newscasters, and
you had to have ambulances stationed at the vaccine centers. I had people telling me the ambulances would be running off with people, 10 times a day or more at vaccine centers. And I think that was one reason they didn't want doctors giving the vaccines. They wanted, they had people from the military reserve giving vaccines. They wanted to be able to control the information coming out of those vaccine sites. But anyway, they exaggerated the illness. They didn't tell us, that kids were basically safe. There were virtually no kids. They lied. They would test everybody who went into a hospital, and since the tests were no good, a lot of the people tested positive, whether or not they had it, and then if those kids died from their cancer or their congenital heart disease, they would say they died of COVID. So they were trying to raise the rates of people who were dying and going into hospitals. And I cited 2 different published papers from 2 different children's hospitals that showed that the majority of children who were claimed to either have COVID and be in the ICU or died of it, it wasn't their primary diagnosis. There was one video that I remember seeing of an ambulance in some Asian country where the writing seemed to be in Chinese or a language like Chinese, but also in English. And I thought, where would that be? Probably Singapore, where they would have both languages. So they were probably filming some of these in Singapore rather than coming from China. Anyway, we were lied to about everything. And we were prevented from getting the drugs, the supplements, remedies. Okay. Yes, that would have helped us. Over-the-counter remedies that would have helped. But there was virtually nobody in ICUs who had a good vitamin D level. If you had a low vitamin D level, you were much more susceptible to getting a severe case of COVID. So we were not told any of these things. We were told not to go outside. We were prevented from getting vitamin D and other vitamins. Vitamin C was helpful also. So these were very evil things that our government did to us, and tells us that they are, wherever this came from, who's ever in charge, these people are willing to do anything.
Dr. Nass, we're running out of time. Could you please tell our audience how they can follow your work?
Yeah, I have a Substack, merylnass.substack.com. And I have 3 shows a month on Children's Health Defense TV, CHD TV. So those are probably the best ways to find me. And previously, I had a blog called anthraxvaccine.blogspot.com, which is still up, but it's a Google blog, free one, and they have taken down some of my posts. And to try to save what's left, I also have merylnass.com, which is simply a compilation of these sites.
Okay. The opinions you hear are, thank you, Dr. Nass, for joining us, and we hope to have you back. It's always, just a real privilege for us to hear you, and for our audience. The opinions you hear are ours and that of our guest, not those of WBAI or the Pacifica Foundation. This content is intended for informational and educational purposes only, and should not be interpreted as professional, medical, or legal advice. Listeners are encouraged to form their own opinions and consult with their own physicians. That wraps up our show for today. This is Uncontrolled Opposition. I'm Gloria Guillo, joined here by Professor Jayme Kuzmarov. Remember to like and share our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Please find us on Substack, Twitter, X, and Podbeam. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next week.
All right, thank you. I have to run. Thank you, Dr. Nass.
Thank you.
Very educational as always. Appreciate it.
It's always good to see you, Jeremy.
If there's
Definitely.
anything
Take
you
care.
didn't have a chance to see, bye, Jeremy. If there's
Thanks,
anything you
Jeremy.
didn't have a chance to say that you really want to say, we're still recording on YouTube, and Jayme can always shove it in the WBAI portion.
Well, one thing I want to bring up, you had this chart, and I couldn't figure out if you talked about it during the show. I didn't know when to flash it up on the screen.
Oh,
Is there anything about this you want to go dive deep into?
It's a great chart.
we never did get into gain of function very much. So at the beginning, when you asked me what is biodefense and what is bioffense, this chart was made. The article was supposedly written by the head of Fort Detrick. I can't remember his name now, Colonel something. I actually had a drink with him once. And also, here we go. Huxall. Yeah. So it is supposedly what Fort Detrick believes the Biological Weapons Convention allows them to do and doesn't allow them to do, and that they're only doing what's allowed. Now, of course, all the research isn't done only at Fort Detrick. They farm out, and especially today, they farm out the vast majority of it. That, Fauci's salary went up by 60% in around 2004 when somebody made the decision to farm out most of it through him, so it would, look more benign, I guess. Or maybe they felt he could do a better job of choosing the where the federal money should go for research into pathogens. And basically, whatever there's money to research, you're going to find scientists outside the government as well as inside who are willing to do it, whatever it is. And this kind of work, can be relatively, especially if it's done in private labs, can be very remunerative.
Well, just looking at this graph, it seems that the track for weapons and defense are pretty much the same in the first initial steps. And then at some point, they diverge.
Yes.
And that divergent point seems to be the virulence, which I guess you're saying is the gain of function component.
Right. So they kept changing the name. So remember, we had germ warfare, and then we had biological warfare, and then we had biological defense. It was all referring to the same stuff. And then someone decided, let's just get a completely new name and call it gain of function and confuse everybody. And in fact, Fauci himself and all his acolytes have worked hard over the last number of years to completely confuse the meaning of that term. What is gain of function? So they will say, well, we can't do vaccine research unless you have gain of function, because making it more immunogenic, creating an attenuated virus that induces a stronger immune response is a gain of function. So they want to say gain of function, it's good gain of function as well as bad gain of function. So we can't stop gain of function research because it's very necessary, for people's health to do gain of function research.
As a non-scientist, I understood gain of function to be something that makes the pathogen more virulent and more contagious. So it's the symptoms are worse that you get from something that's a bioweapon.
More damages your immune system.
And more damaging, and also it spreads easier.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And I've written about that at a little bit of length in an article I wrote 3 years ago, saying that the pandemic treaty would cause more pandemics. So anyway, first of all, you have to clear up the terminology, because these people are just trying to muddy the waters about what you can and can't do. And so what Huxell said at the time is that you can't make pathogens more virulent. You can't stabilize. Stabilization means making it so you don't kill the virus or bacterium when you release it in a bomb or spray it and, or create a situation.
Well, so can we go off on a tangent? When I was reading your work, I was reading that the spores from anthrax are more difficult to or more difficult to kill, or more adaptable to an environment than maybe bacteria or virus. Did I read that right?
Yeah, yes. So anthrax is relatively unique as a bacterium in making its own spore. So normally, for almost all bacteria, they don't make a spore. Spores are in fungi. But anthrax makes a really resistant spore. And so in the environment, it can last 100 years. And then when the right conditions occur, so somehow it knows when there's the right nutrients, the right temperature, the right amount of moisture, etc., it will come out of the spore form. It's amazing. Like, how does it know? Okay, but the spore will break down and the bacteria will start to reproduce. And when that happens, which usually happens every 20 or 50 years, that's when you get anthrax in the soil. And when cattle, say, are being moved from Texas up to the Dakotas and into Canada, where they're going to be slaughtered, if they find that soil where the anthrax bacteria have now opened up and become bacteria, so while they're a spore form, they're sort of in suspended animation. And then they come out and start reproducing, and you get a lot of them in the soil if they can outcompete the other soil organisms, and cattle will start getting anthrax and dying in a particular area. And so every year or two, you're going to hear about some part of Canada or some part of the U.S. South or West where a bunch of cattle suddenly get anthrax, because you can't really clean up all the soil where there are anthrax spores. And so anthrax was like the prototype biological weapon from the early 1900s, because you could release it from a bomb and it wouldn't die as long as it was in the spore form. It would die if it was in the what's called the vegetative form, which is when it's acting more like a bacterium.
The other thing that I noticed when I reviewed your chart that I don't know if Jayme could put it back up, is the concept of stockpiling, and how stockpiling is associated more with bioweapons than it is bioresearch. Is that something?
Right, because you don't need large quantities for bioresearch, but this is a sort of a misnomer. This is designed to throw you off, because you really, and we did. Look, the United States did stockpile tons of biological weapons before the Biological Weapons Convention, which came into force in 1975. So between, say, 1943 and 1975, the United States had, tons of anthrax and other biological weapons that it had produced. But then it supposedly burned them all up, incinerated them. But it didn't need much, because only a little bit that only much less than a gram is necessary to start the whole thing up again, to grow it. And in the open literature, there are just, I mean, this is what I found amazing back in the 80s when I first started studying anthrax, was you could read published papers about how to grow anthrax in, 40-liter or 100-liter vats, written by people who worked at Fort Detrick or had moved from Fort Detrick to the NIH. So it's relatively easy to grow these things and separate them and create weapons as needed. It's sort of like hot water on demand. Bacteria and viruses on demand.
I think also there were two other things that you brought up that were really interesting as far as why this FBI paper blaming Fort Detrick was easily a fallacy, and one of them was when they were looking for to find out what was actually in the vials. They were asking labs to voluntarily submit this stuff.
Yes.
And please talk about that
right.
part.
Yeah. So, as I said, it was a Keystone Cops investigation, and the FBI wanted to say we've put more man hours into this than any other investigation we've ever undertaken. We've just done everything possible. We've done all this new science. What they did was ask anthrax scientists in the US and around the world to please supply us with your anthrax samples. Now, if you were a scientist who had developed an anthrax weapon and had, sent the letters, are you going to voluntarily send the FBI your samples that you used in the letters? Of course not. So this was all just for show. There were a few people in the US that were the FBI, maybe came in and took samples. But even then, if you don't know what's in the you've given these people a lot of time to hide their samples. You could go into their lab and grab what they have, but what they have, if they actually made the letters, isn't going to be there anymore.
And so the other thing you said is that many labs, thousands of labs, aren't registered.
Well, we don't know how many aren't registered. So there's no registration in the US. So we know about all the labs that the government pays for, right? And we know about most university labs, any lab that publishes papers. But private entities still to this day can create their own bioweapons lab. We saw these little rinky-dink labs in California, for instance, that were being run by Chinese nationals. Those are rinky-dink. Those were not, BSL-4, but there's nothing to stop you creating your own biosafety level 4 lab, to study these pathogens here in the US or overseas. There are plenty of countries that don't have governments that function enough to know, where the labs are. You could, I don't know. Why are we so frightened about the labs in Odessa? Why did we put more than 40 labs in Ukraine? Some of these labs were built since 2010. We're not talking about old Soviet labs. We're talking about US-supported, US-built labs that only were just recently created. What was that about? The other thing that happened is it was an Ames. So what was in the anthrax letters was an Ames strain of anthrax, and the FBI said, well, there's 3 or 4 other countries that have the Ames strain, and it was our most virulent strain, and so we're going to go look in those countries. But I, having been studying anthrax for decades, knew that there were more countries than that. There were about 10 countries that I knew of that had the Ames strain, because the Ames strain was what you tested your vaccines against. Because it was the most virulent, you wanted to see if the vaccine would protect against the most virulent strain.
So that was the benchmark.
Yeah, exactly. So the FBI wasn't even going to all the countries that had the Ames anthrax. So that was, all these things were red flags that told me this FBI investigation is clearly not serious.
Well, it resulted in a giant boon in their funding. I forgot what it was, something like over 2,000% increase from 50 million to $1.5 billion to
10
20 billion today,
or
I think
more,
you were saying.
Even up to and before COVID. So God knows what it is now.
And then it provided some cover.
That's per year, 10 billion per year.
And then it provided some cover for the attack on Iraq and some justification. So they really got a big bang for their buck on this. And we don't know for sure, but it might have encouraged a couple of senators to kind of back off on their analysis of an opposition to any points in the Patriot Act. So really, if we're looking at motives, we got three big ones here. So, that's what we do. We look at, what happens. And sometimes you have to wait a little bit to see, it sounds fishy, but until you really see who benefits and who loses, you're not 100% sure. But I'd say, we got a couple of smoking guns here. So
yes.
Well, I don't want to, keep everybody. Also, I really like this book. It's called Clouds of Secrecy. It's the Army's germ warfare tests over populated areas. And, I can honestly say that in having studied just a tiny bit, because I have no scientific background, understanding just a tiny bit of the bioweapons program made me question what was being told to me by our government when the COVID narrative came out and when the vaccine narrative came out. It made me think twice, because I knew historically our government has absolutely no problem testing out pathogens on us. And this particular book talks about where that's done and how it's done. And it's pretty scary. And this is an old book too. It's not even, really a new book, but these kind of things, when you understand the depth and breadth and, that people are willing to go through to move an objective forward and to create a control grid, you're skeptical. So I don't know, with this show, we hope that all we can do here is just make people think, ask the right questions, and follow Dr. Nass's excellent work. And I can say personally, Dr. Nass's work has helped me personally through some really difficult times with the whole COVID narrative and, my own health. And, I'm really thankful she joins us on the show and is talking to our audience.
Let me just say that book was written by Leonard Cole, and he was in a group, Council for Responsible Genetics, with me over 30 years ago.
Wow.
Good guy. He started out as a dentist, interestingly, and worked at University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey in Newark. And that book is about tests that were done in the 50s and 60s that he learned through FOIAs, I think. Another person who was in that group was, what's his name? Professor Boyle, Francis Boyle.
Right.
He was who died last year.
A lot of people think he was off, that he was.
Yeah, right. But I don't think they have any evidence. I have not seen a shred of evidence to suggest that. So, and he was 75. I think he may have known the
timing was, I think the timing was very suspicious from what people say.
He'd been a activist for his whole career, and so he'd been doing big cases before this, and they left him alone. So I don't know, I don't know. I don't have an opinion on it, but it's just speculation. But he was a very good guy, as was Leonard Cole.
And one of the things that also struck me in reading this book is that when you contaminate, like you're saying, when you contaminate something with anthrax spores, it's a long time. It's almost like a radioactive situation. And he had talked about certain buildings being shut in Fort Detrick that people couldn't go in, and certain not countries, but islands and things like that where people couldn't step foot in them. Yes. I think one was off the coast of Britain.
Yeah, Grunard Island off the coast of Scotland had been used as a test site with anthrax spores during World War II, because we were working with the Brits to make anthrax cattle cakes that we were going to drop in Germany to kill their cattle, starve them if the war had gone on long enough. And so nobody could go to Grunard Island for many years. And then I think it was the late 80s, maybe it was the 90s, the Brits actually put piping in and
the formaldehyde, right?
And dilute formaldehyde, and were able to kill the spores and reclaim the island and maybe give it back to its original owners.
Wow.
The destructive nature of some of these ideas we have is just, it's outrageous. And because they have lasting effects that go on for years past the battles that they want to just fight and win at the time. And it's really disgusting. And we have a lot of that too with like uranium munitions as well.
Zimbabwe had the world's largest anthrax epidemic starting in 1978 during its civil war. And it was, this was caused, it was a biological weapons and event. And spores were spread over many areas of Zimbabwe, all of which were so they had apartheid. And so blacks lived in certain areas and whites in other areas. So it's only in the black areas. And so subsequently, they've had anthrax events. Now, pretty much every year, there's somewhere where the anthrax spores are in the soil where they come up again and cause problems. So they have a lot more anthrax now than they ever did before.
We've always seen the predator class as being racist and racist eugenicists. And, it is. Jayme, we would almost be remiss not to say this, but Jayme brought to my attention as I was prepping for the show that Rubio is giving this speech today, which is basically saying that, any gloves that were ever on or off as far as, anyone who's going to say anything against the prevailing narratives. And he lists as reasons for this, all of these events, which Jeremy and I have like picked at that are false flags. And it's really quite a list. It's actually a useful list because, we could pick off almost every single one of those things as a false flag. And he's claiming that these were done by all, leftists and, just terrorists and things like that. When actually, when we look for the receipts, it's the DOD, or now the DOW, the Department of War, that holds the receipts. And that was a big joke going into Iraq. I recall there was a comedian, I forgot his name, and he says, yeah, we knew they had the weapons because we had the receipts. So,
right.
It's just, it's become even a crazier world. Hold on, guys. Just hold on. That's all we can do. So,
and with that, thank you very much for having me.
Oh, it's been really a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a very enlightening conversation. All right. Well, I guess we'll wrap up. I want to thank Craig Pasta Jardula. He's executive producer of Uncontrolled Opposition. Thank you for allowing us to run the show on Pasta to Go channel. He will be back live tomorrow, I believe, at 8 a.m. to do drive time. He had to cancel this morning for personal reasons. So with that, we'll say thank you for watching. Thanks to Jeremy. Thanks to Dr. Mass. Thank you for being here and have a great weekend. We'll
Thanks
see you
to
next
Jayme.
week. Thank you. I can't thank myself, but we'll be back next week with another episode. And have a good one. Have a good weekend, everybody. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.